And Richard Charlewood is a hematologist trained in South Africa and is a transfusion specialist for the New Zealand Blood Bank Service. So, gentlemen, take it away. Thank you.
Thanks, Pat, and welcome to all of you. Thanks to the organizing committee and to the West Australian Airway Group for having us. Richard and I are going to tag team back and forth, so we promise, Pat, we keep to time. We just want to obviously thank you guys, but also acknowledge the Whadjuk Noongar people of it's called the Swan Coastal Plain, and just, I guess, recognize that this is where the city's situated, but also the elders past, present, and emerging. So just respect for that. The other part is, we feel a little bit out of sorts. Correct me if you go wrong, but we feel a bit like the hobbits that came out of the Shire, and we're going to tell you about our experience, and really it's a celebration of the New Zealand Blood Service and their progressive mindset. So I want to put that up front, but it's a little bit about, as Sir Isaac Newton said, it's standing on the shoulders of giants. So we've read a lot of the work of people that around this room have put in. So it's I guess a thank you to you guys as well. And the other part is, it feels as though we're learning, but we're just getting absolutely made a mess of at the same time. So I didn't even know we had platelets. So if I'm looking blankly or looking at Richard for guidance, it's for those reasons. And so the last thing is, out of respect for Pat and Richard, who, as you'll hear, is from Johannesburg, and I'm Canadian, so we don't even play rugby really. I just wanted to acknowledge the international spirit that's here in the room, and congratulate South Africa on the Rugby World Cup. So I'll put it over to Richard.
Right, thanks, Chris. So New Zealand Blood Service is a small blood service by international standards. New Zealand's about the same size as the United Kingdom, but it's got about 1/10 of the population. With that size, of course, there's a lot of geographical issues that we face. What's a little unusual about us also is that we're a vein-to-vein blood service, so we do all the collection, processing, testing. We also run 6 of the bigger hospital laboratory blood banks and have oversight of all of the blood banks. So what happens clinically is of pivotal importance for us. So we talked a little bit about whole blood, this conference, just a little, and so New Zealand has whole blood and has had for many years, and I think as Mark Yeaser mentioned, it's quite a difficult, and Denise Marks, it's quite a difficult product to collect. If you're using own eggs, and we can have that discussion later, you're generally looking at Cal negative as well, that is the New Zealand policy. We use a hemolysin test, so not an IgM test, just actually looking for hemolysis. It's a quick and easy test to do. And we have a titer set at 50, and we actually managed to do quite well in terms of numbers of donors for that. Male donors, again, for the Charlie risk, no previous transfusions. Leukodepleted, so everything in New Zealand is leukodepleted, as it is here in Australia. That means no platelets, because we don't have the platelet-sparing filter, but we'll get on to that. And I haven't factored in the antiplatelet agents, so you're probably looking at maybe 3% of donors being eligible to donate. So it's a scarce resource. And as a blood provider, there are a lot of competing demands for that scarce resource. So anything that contains plasma as a product is then a Charlie risk. So you're looking at exactly the same group, the intrauterine transfusions, the exchange transfusions, which we do exceptionally rarely, but always have blood available in all 3 regions across the country. Pediatric cardiac bypass, and then own eggs, we generally are used for phenotyping because you can give them to anybody, so that's your best investment for phenotyping reagents. CMV testing, again, first up will be the own eggs. And then, of course, you've got all the small blood banks scattered all over the country that need high levels of own eggs, and blood fridge stock in the small private hospitals, again, scattered everywhere. So there's a lot of pressure on those donors. And then we get on to whole blood, and I think it's easy for us to sit here and say, you know, which curve would you rather be on? But when it comes to making a submission to the regulator, you have to have really robust data. And, you know, when you look at retrospective studies, which is where quite a few of those curves come from, that's probably not going to stack up that well with the regulator. It's probably also not going to stack up that well with blood service management. So we do need to be quite careful about what we're asking of the blood service. We know there are issues around the stability of coagulation factors, and you can see that in the varying shelf lives of whole blood. We know that THOR plasma has a much shorter shelf life. You know, again, those are things that we can discuss and argue about, but when it comes to actually getting a change implemented for a blood service, where you're asking people to put time, money, effort, resource, blood donors, donations on the line, we do need to have very solid evidence. And then we move on to platelet-sparing filters. Again, for a blood service, this is a new process stream, and I'll touch on that in the next slide. We've got a shelf life of platelets at room temperature of 7 days. Sure, we're going to chill them, so that makes life a bit easier. There is the issue that platelets are not supposed to be given through blood warmers if you follow the AABB guidance. And then you have the issue around wastage at smaller sites. And we can just put warm, fresh whole blood off the table for civilian blood, unless you're going to do walking blood donor banks in very remote areas, which we don't really have in New Zealand. The regulatory requirements for blood will require that everything gets NAT tested, and as soon as you do NAT testing, you're off warm whole blood. So the processing of blood, and I will just address the elephant in the room just very briefly, which is that not transfused 17,000 at the bottom there, which is large. This is an intention to donate graph, if you like, so it includes all the deferred donors for whatever reason they had. But you can see there that out of 120,000 odd donations, pre-hospital transfusion and in fact whole blood in its entirety, whether for exchange, which is whole blood plasma reduced, represents a very small percentage of what a blood service actually does. So you're really asking a tank going down a road just to be careful of that little stone in the road. And it is quite a big ask of a large organization that has a very well-established machinery to change the way they're doing things. Of course, with blood services, there are all the regulatory issues, the quality control issues, maintaining competency issues, and essentially what I'm saying is it's a complicated beast to deal with, and it isn't quite as simple just to say, well, we'd like it, so give it to us. The evidence of benefit, I think we're getting there. Some of the trials, the randomized controlled trials are coming through, refill aside, are showing support for this, and I think we'll get there as far as the RCTs are concerned. I think there's a clear advantage in the pre-hospital environment where the logistics of having to handle multiple different components compared to just one is quite obvious, and the same for austere environments. I do think we need to be careful about the message that we're saying about oxygen. All stored blood basically has had 2,3 dpg removed, so there is no oxygen carrying capacity to speak of. If you talk to the hematology patients who are getting blood on a regular basis, and you ask them immediately after the transfusion, did that make you feel better? They'll all say yes, well, certainly in New Zealand, because we're polite like that and we don't want to offend. But if you press them hard, they'll say, no, it takes me 2 to 3 days, and then I start feeling better. And that's when the 2,3 dpg gets replaced. So possibly the issue with blood transfusions is more just getting the viscosity up of the blood so that you're getting blood flowing through the microcirculation so that you're getting the dissolved oxygen through, or the patient's own red cells, if they're still around, getting the oxygen through and the lactate out. All right, so having been all gloomy about all of that, so we actually already have whole blood in New Zealand. So like Phil Spinella, that was a grandfathered product for us. So the blood service has only actually been around since 1998. It was a bunch of regional blood services before that. And pediatric cardiac bypass in Auckland wanted fresher whole blood for their bypass. And they put a 5-day shelf life on that. So after 5 days, we always had this product left over. So we had an understanding within the hospital that if we had whole blood that was not for pediatric bypass, that it would be used on any actively bleeding patient, whether that's a massive transfusion protocol, which we didn't have back in 1998, or just somebody who's bleeding actively in theatre. And the hospital was quite fine with that. So when Chris Denny came along and said, it'd be really nice if we could carry some blood, and I said, well, we've got this whole blood that's kind of just lying around doing nothing, and it seems like a logical use for it to use. Chris was quite pleased with that. Yeah, I think though the Auckland HEMS team are the only people that carry blood as stock in New Zealand. And that is because they have a doctor on site who's actually assessing the patient. So blood is a prescription medicine in New Zealand, so you do need a doctor to make that call. There are discussions about whether that can be remote or not, but current New Zealand policy is that it has to be an on-site prescriber. We do make a distinction between holding blood as stock. So the Auckland HEMS team have 2 units of whole blood at all times, whereas rescue helicopters and other sites can just say, hey, look, there's a fractured this or whatever up in the ski slopes. I'd like to take some blood with me. There'll be a doctor there, and off they go. So that works a little bit differently. To be fair to Chris's team, they are exemplary in their stock management and their cold chain management. And I think that is really very helpful when it comes to making the case for pre-hospital transfusion elsewhere in the country, that you have a stellar example to start with. So can we extend it further into the country? There's certainly enthusiasm from emergency departments and theatre staff for that. I'd have to say that the blood service management isn't quite as excited about it. We have an awful lot of projects on the go. I know a lot of people think we just collect blood and hand it out the door, but there isn't a lot that goes on in between there. And this is yet another project to add on to the list. We are taking part in the UK SWIFT trial, which compares red cells and plasma versus platelet-rich whole blood. In the New Zealand context, we'll be comparing platelet-poor whole blood with platelet-rich whole blood. So we're really keen to get some numbers on that and see if that makes a difference. There is obviously a clear logistic advantage. I don't need to tell this audience that. And I think the data is certainly getting there, that we'll be able to get this across the line fairly soon. And with that, I will hand you back to Chris.
All right. I'm aware when Tanya, because we sort of said, hey, Tanya, there's nobody from New Zealand coming to talk. Will you let us in? She's like, all right. But you guys, talk about the implementation part of this. Let's talk about the change management. So I'm going to explain a little bit about that. And we're keen to get your feedback. I think we've made some calls that were like, that worked out pretty good. And there's some where we're like, that was a terrible idea. So I just want to make the point, this is not in granite. That's the name of the service. For those who haven't been to New Zealand, and I'll just describe it in 1 or 2 minutes worth. I think the context is important. But the history is very much out of surf lifesaving. And so it came out of post-Vietnam, people with small bathing suits, which they call togs, big mustaches, and it was all about static line rescue. And so just to make the point that we have quite a mixed mission set of profiles. I think for those who haven't been there, 2 islands, we're up towards the top here in Auckland. James and his team would be down here in Wellington. That's our capital. Christchurch has been in the news more than it would like. And then Dunedin's where one of the medical schools are. So we've kind of got, 4 or 5 major trauma centers spread out. You can see the distance, that's about 200 kilometers. But it's not a big place. And I think the population, as Richard mentioned, is about the size of Melbourne. This is where we live. So Auckland is the largest city. It'd be about 1.7 million people or thereabouts. They call it the City of Sails. So this is us just flying back from a mission looking north towards Rangitoto. It's a little bit disconcerting as a Canadian when there's volcanic plateaus everywhere. And that came out of the ocean only about 600 years ago. So we're hoping that it's going to keep resting. The Indigenous population, different from Australia, we have almost 1 in 5, 17% of the population would identify as being Maori. And we'll come back to that in terms of equity of access to care. In terms of what we have as a fleet, and I was drooling over the Norwegian infrastructure, so credit to you guys for what you've been able to achieve. We have a mix of rotary wing and road-based vehicles. We're flying the sort of little cousin of the AW139, which most of Australia is currently flying in. So this is a Leonardo AW169. And then we have response vehicles, which are essentially what the cops have. It's just they said they were losing the bottoms of them because they were too low, so we got the 4x4 version with a hope of a little bit more clearance. We have 2 bases. One is up in Northland, which is the most impoverished and also the largest Indigenous part of New Zealand. So that's quite a challenge for us. And then Auckland, which is kind of the big smoke, even though it's not. I thought I'd tell you this story because our story is not, and I have no military background whatsoever, so as much as we've learned from the military, the experience we have, and the story I'll tell you is a bit more about a civilian experience in the Southern Hemisphere. And it is about trying to learn remote damage control resuscitation strategies and how do we apply those in our setting. And it's a little bit about care and motion. We're often challenged about stay and play, load and go. And I think that concept, which I think is a Canadian phrase, but that care and motion is something that we really strive to do at all times. Our team, we have a flight critical care paramedic. She or he is partnered with what in Australasia is called a prehospital and retrieval medicine doctor. And then we typically fly with 1 pilot, 1 air crew officer. So if I can paint a picture, and this is what it looks like. It's not maybe as pretty as Perth, but she's not far off. We had a paraglider going into the side of a hill. You could almost call it a cliff. And so it was an interesting, blunt trauma is our sort of raison d'etre, but it was quite an impressive mechanism in quite an austere environment. And so one of the challenges for us as we're getting there, and we're often first on scene, is that mixture, and I think Tanya's talk really captured that well. It's how do you balance the provision of pre-hospital critical care with all of those operational challenges. And so I'll just show you if this works. Kelly, fingers crossed. This is kind of what ends up happening. Again, it's not as exciting, I suppose, as being in a sort of a battle, but it's this idea of how do I keep myself safe? How do I keep my team safe? What do I want to bring? Because to Tanya's point, if you get down there and you decide you want to transfuse and the helicopter is bugged out, it doesn't really support what you're trying to achieve. So here we're lowering down with our winch stretcher and what we think we need for sort of the first 15 minutes. But it's quite a challenge, I find, as a hospital-based emergency physician, thinking about those competing priorities and what's killing the patient now. That's sort of the way we've been taught is it's what does this person need? In this case, it was, as you can imagine, hemorrhage control, but from a non-compressible torso hemorrhage, in this case, an unstable pelvis, a lot of kind of minimum handling, just enough vascular access to give a pinch of pain relief and some TXA. But we could provide transfusion and ultrasound in flight. And we debrief these missions quite a lot because we're still learning how to find difficult insertion and extraction strategies with still providing good care. But I'd be keen to hear what others are thinking about this, and again, it gives you an idea about the challenges that we face. I do want to just sing out, and we're lucky, like we partner with police, fire, ambulance, there's some Defence Force partners here, we've got Coast Guard, Surf Life Saving, but Blood Service as a hospital-based partner have been amazing. And as much as, you've got a bit of like the curmudgeonly grandfather voice on today, but actually Richard is as progressive within the Blood Services I've seen, and has been a real champion for what does the patient require, and just helping us kind of cut through those layers of unnecessary bureaucracy. So I point that out because one of the things we do, and this gets back, we'll talk about some quality measures, but our wastage is blood services pack our blood up for us, and their data logging and the security seal, and that sort of, if you will, we have confidence in what's in the box, which means we don't have to like open it up and just check that we've got 2 sandwiches, like it's just there for us, and that's been really powerful. I'd be curious to hear what others are thinking about, and just a real tip of the hat to both John and Alana for the work being done in New South Wales. But we travel with 2 pints of cold, stored, whole blood, and it seems about right to us. I'll show you, we are, in the group that we have with the mission profiles we carry and the distances that we're moving right now, that seems about the right amount. But invariably, there's a big case, and then the clinicians are like on about how we couldn't get more. So I'm really excited to think about how we can use some geospatial, I guess, awareness to support us with other transfusion products. This, I guess, is also potentially controversial. Because we were the first in New Zealand to be doing this, we felt we had to have some objective criteria. So we set upon the assessment of blood consumption, or the ABC score, as a tool to guide our transfusion triggers. Again, I'd be keen to get some feedback on what other groups are using. It works reasonably well for us. Obviously, it's catering for an adult population. I think we do fly with pre-hospital point-of-care ultrasound. There's the critical hemorrhage that's not hard to see, and then there's the ones where I think we often note there's hemorrhage mimics, and the British often talk about the hateful eight and how do you distinguish physiologic instability from actually bleeding. So I'd be keen to hear from folks who've sorted that out. And I apologize for this slide, I just couldn't quite get it big enough, but what's been really powerful, and we're lucky because we have the incoming National Trauma Network chair here with us as well for New Zealand, is we've tried to build, I guess, links in the chain of survival all along the way. So this is the national, we call it the Health Quality Safety Commission approach to critical hemorrhage. And without squinting too much, I'll just say we kind of agreed upon transfusion triggers, and notice whole blood actually got in there. The concept of a code crimson, again, thanks to New South Wales for great phrases, and then actually trying to connect the dots into definitive care. So that took longer than it should have, but it is, I think, really important to build confidence across the various phases of care. And just to make the point, this is our local massive hemorrhage pathway. We've evolved from massive transfusion, I'll get there, is you can see a patient could reasonably expect to get 4 units of whole blood as part of their kind of initial assessment. And a lot of that is, I think the blood service think that us emerge docs have no opposable thumbs. So when they try to give us anything more sophisticated, they're like, no, just give them the pints of that whole blood stuff. It's way simpler for everybody. So stewardship, again, the point that we really haven't had any blood wastage in the last year and a half. I think once we got people to quit peeking and reminded them there's a little kind of layer in the cake. So if you take the first unit out, there's a card from blood service saying, close the lid. It's kind of like putting the seat down, I guess, after you go for a pee. So we've got pretty good, I think, engineering for safety. And the other part is, it's been a lot of learning from our military mates in terms of just task clustering and trying to get the right stuff in front of us, but not more than what we need to carry. The training, I will make the point, it seems so easy. I was in this room and everybody just seems to like get transfused, it's magic, but man, it's like our IQ drops when we get to the helicopter, and then there's a scary patient, the IQ drops again. And so we have to actually push the teams quite hard, and you can see the woman here is getting used to pump sets, and you think most people can do that, but we put, we're sort of overtraining it, work gloves on. You'll see she's about to put a blindfold on, and we find that overcommitment, that muscle memory, particularly for clinicians who obviously in the hospital you just kind of look and the nurses have worked the magic already for you. So I think our paramedics have been very patient with us, and just to say, I think that's been a key to our success. And then just a pinch of data to say that if you look at the operational stuff we do, this is just talking about how do we get there, and about 80% of the time we fly. The road vehicle is great for obviously inclement weather, maintenance issues, or just proximity to base. And about 2/3 of the time, it's daytime activation. But Aucklanders are actually quite civilized. They don't seem to get into the same gunfights that we experience back home in Toronto, and certainly the Americans would know more about. So they do seem to put themselves to bed at a reasonable hour. This is just a bit of clinical stuff to say, and I should have said, I went back, I had one of our fellows go back and help with the last 150 patients we transfused. Those 150 patients got just over 220 units. So on rough numbers, about 1.5 units of whole blood per patient. And you can see males are about 2/3 of the group. That shouldn't surprise anyone. And mechanism, this is interesting only in that blunt trauma is by far the lion's share of the mechanism of injury in New Zealand, but actually penetrating trauma makes, I think that ends up being about 14% of the work we see, which is higher than the actual proportion of penetrating trauma in the region. All right, this is just a bit about the ABC score. I'll try and pick up some time. The challenges and tensions, so this, I guess, is just to be upfront and say, I think the equity of access to care, it's interesting, there's still a strong and healthy skepticism in New Zealand about do we need pre-hospital blood, and if so, what? So I'd say that that is an element we're working on. And as I mentioned, that whole concept that's already been mentioned, Australia knows this well, which is there's a large portion of the population who don't live close to a major trauma center. That's a real area I think would work for us in the near future. How do we make good use of a scarce resource? And partly it's, full credit to the Blood Service for being willing to produce this, and can we produce it reliably up and down the country? And then we've talked about the links in the chain of survival. Last piece, and then I might see if Richard wants to come up and say anything else, is just been quite fortunate, the SWIFT trial, and there's lots of RCTs currently happening, but this is a National Health Service blood and transplant trial involving UK Ministry of Defence. I think you've kindly been supporting it with funding, but there's 10 air ambulance charities, mainly in England, who are participating in this study. Primary outcome will be all-cause mortality at 24 hours, and I think also, thanks Pat, looking at the rate of massive transfusion defined as greater than 10 units in 24 hours. So I think those are the two primary outcome measures. They're about 25% of the way through enrollment. Fingers crossed. Blood Services is doing the validation on the Terumo platelet-sparing filters. I'm chomping to get us in there before the summer season gets busy and crazy. In the last 2 minutes, I guess I just wanted to finish with saying what's been said around, and this is to me is the lesson I've taken from change management, is that implementation science is a thing. If there's one piece that our new consultants get an earful of regularly is that there's quite a science that guides behavioral change, and I think that we're seeing in New Zealand, the whole healthcare system is transforming in front of us. So we're trying to appreciate that as a complex adaptive system and trying to see where does resuscitation fit in as kind of an emergent part of that. So just really want to say thank you. Our names are up there. Feel free to send us an email or catch us afterwards, and thank you for your time.